Welcome to the Max Weinreich Center's Fellowship Lecture, Libe and Linguistics Towards an Archive of Yiddish Sexuality by Zohar Weiman-Kelman, who is the recipient of the 2014-2015 Dina Abramowicz Emerging Scholar Fellowship at YIVO. I'd just like to say a couple words about the person for whom the fellowship is named. Dina Abramowicz served as the assistant librarian at YIVO from 1947 to 1962, the chief librarian from 1962 to 1987, and the reference librarian from 1987 until her death in April of 2000. Born in Vilna, Dina served as a librarian in the Vilna ghetto during the Nazi occupation. After the liquidation of the ghetto, she escaped from a deportation train and served in a Jewish partisan unit until liberation. Working at a revived YIVO in New York after the war, she became one of YIVO's most prominent figures, and through her work as a librarian was instrumental to the scholarship of numerous emerging and leading academics. A scholar in her own right, she was fluent in 4 languages and was known as one of the last of the Vilna intelligentsia. The Dina Abramowicz Emerging Scholar Fellowship was established by YIVO in her honor in 2001 to perpetuate her work. Past recipients of this fellowship include Magda Tatar, Elisa Bemporad, Natalia Alexion, and Karolina Shimaniak, and now Zohar Weiman-Kelman. I'd like to add that if you enjoy our programs, you should consider becoming a YIVO member today. Actually, I'd like to ask, how many card-carrying members of YIVO do we have here? I'm just curious. We could use some more, so please, it doesn't take much. Please consider becoming a member. We rely on your support to continue our work. We're also seeking volunteers. If you'd like to be involved with our work, our public programs, education opportunities, or development in our development department, we'd love to have you on board. For more information about volunteering, please see Leah Falk after the program. Leah Falk is waving her hand. She's standing in the blue shirt over there. And you can visit the table in front of the door to find YIVO membership forms. It is now my pleasure to introduce Zohar Weiman-Kelman. Zohar holds the Anne Tannenbaum Postdoctoral Fellowship at the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. Born and raised in West Jerusalem, she received her BA in Hebrew and Yiddish literature from the Hebrew University. She completed her PhD in comparative literature with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality at UC Berkeley in 2012. Her research has led her to learn Yiddish, German, and Polish, and she is deeply engaged in queer and feminist communities in Berlin, Warsaw, and Israel. Zohar is currently completing her first book manuscript, What to Expect When You're Not Expecting, Jewish Women's Poetry, 1880 to 1990. This is a great title. She's also begun a new project, Philology, Sexology, and the Future of Yiddish, looking at the intersections of Yiddish language and sexuality. She will now speak on Libe and Linguistics Towards an Archive of Yiddish Sexuality. Please welcome Zohar Weiman-Kelman.
Thanks, Eddie. Thank you, everybody, for coming. In a speech given at the annual convention of the Association of Jewish Libraries in 1998, Dina Abramowicz urges the lucky post-Holocaust generations, as she says, to remember the courageous and dedicated individuals who struggled against incredible odds to save the spiritual riches of their people accumulated during the centuries. Abramowicz herself certainly belongs to these individuals, and as I go in search of new, maybe less explored materials from the Yiddish past, I am indeed so grateful to Dina Abramowicz and to all the individuals who made YIVO's work possible historically, especially Max Weinreich and Mordkhe Schechter, who I will be talking about today, and also to all of those making the archive and the center work today, whether it's looking for the smallest document or information or having this whole organization run smoothly. I am indeed very grateful. The archive, both as a physical place and as a theoretical concept, is part of what I'm interested in exploring with you today. Don't worry, we'll also get to the dirty parts, because I'm thinking about the archive in relation to Yiddish, and about Yiddish in relation to sexuality, and about sexuality in relation to history. So these are sort of, I don't know if it's a triangle or a square, but the pieces that I'm trying to juggle through the materials that we'll read today. In this project, language is the link between sexuality and history. We might be able to say that language is always the link between history and sexuality, because language is one of the main ways that history of sexuality is mediated to us across history, that is, through language. When the language in question is Yiddish, mediation itself becomes charged, because there's a history that has been disrupted by the Churban, by Zionism, by Stalinism, and by less violent processes of immigration and assimilation. So we can say we have a reality that existed in Yiddish that was, to a certain extent, lost, and at the same time, to a certain extent, we have lost the Yiddish needed to access that reality. This loss renders the archive itself one of the main sites of Yiddish sexuality and blurs the distinction between the archive and the bedroom. The bedroom, writes Anne Cvetkovich, is the space of the queer archive. Cvetkovich explains that the creators of grassroots gay and lesbian archives often turned their bedrooms into safe havens for history, emphasizing both the intimate and the ephemeral nature of the queer archive. The queer mixture of archive and bedroom is the perfect site for an archive of Yiddish sexuality. And indeed, the archives I will discuss today are bedroom archives of sorts, or that's how I like to think of them, because YIVO wasn't always the institution we sit in now, but rather started in Max Weinreich's Vilna apartment in 1925. And the section of Mordkhe Schechter's archive, which I will discuss today, ended up in his son Binyamin's Manhattan home. When Cvetkovich writes of the bedroom archive, she's also referring to and reaffirming the bond between queerness and sexual practice. I'll break this down a little bit slowly. So the archives are queer in the sense of being makeshift, unofficial, and also queer in the type of sexual content they hold, as in referring to queer sex, non-heterosexual sex being described and depicted. Similarly, the Yiddish archives I will look at directly engage sexual practice at the same time as they are queer in other ways of being non-normative, especially in relation to reproductive heteronormativity. Everybody can practice saying that. It sounds, this sounds better in English than it does in Yiddish. Thanks, friends. So that's something like the command to make babies and the value system that is the symbolic value system derived from that social structure. Now, it's my argument and others that Yiddish today does not entirely fit this system because of the way it is, for the most part, at least outside of ultra-Orthodox circles, no longer passed down as a mother tongue across generations of nuclear and biological families, and is very often, for many of us here, alternatively acquired. This is a queerness that I attribute to Yiddish, following Jeffrey Chandler and many others. Chandler describes what I take as the kind of perfect criticism against alternative models of transmission when he's told a Yiddish speaker should be made in the bedroom, not in the classroom. While I don't share that heteronormative understanding of cultural transmission through the family and across generations, I am interested in what happens when we take Yiddish back into the bedroom. Recognizing the potential of a history configured through and as sexual practice in Yiddish, a good place to start is sexology, which, according to Gail Rubin, is the best place to encounter what she calls living, breathing, speaking inverts and perverts. For Rubin, sexology is a site to encounter those who would not find themselves in other modes of archival history. For Yiddish history, sexology gives us both those otherwise lost histories of those at the margins of society, but also a perspective on Yiddish culture that does not conform to popular imagination of the Yiddish past. What I call elsewhere a kind of fetishizing of Yiddish, romanticizing, nostalgia of Yiddish, and what I offer instead is fetishism in Yiddish, but that's another project. So although there are not many works of Yiddish sexology, the array that I've found in my research here does offer a representative glimpse into the particular transnational and intercultural positioning of the Yiddish past. I should clarify what I mean by sexology, but I'm sort of still with a working definition. Some of the works I'm looking at are sort of straight-up studies of sexual behavior and deviance. Some are more practical in terms of manuals related to marriage, reproduction, even birth control. And some are more sociological or sociolinguistic. As I work more in depth, I hope to have a better definition, but let me share some of the things I have so far and to give you more of a sense. So what we have up there is a translation, 1929 translation of Otto Weiniger's Geschlecht und Charakter. So that's translated from German. We have Margaret Sanger's What Every Girl Should Know. And for those of you who don't know, she's the neighbor next door in the building. So we have the Yiddish translation of Was jede Mädel darf wissen from 1916. A translation of there's Max Hoden's German Bub und Mädel, translated in 1929, published in Riga as Jingel und Mädel, Chaversche Schmuisen wegen der Geschlechtsfrage. That's that one. And, oh, not yet. Okay, so that's just a taste of, we have Riga, we have Warsaw, we have the US, we have Russian translation, German translations, translations from English, and a whole lot of original Yiddish sexology coming from one character, my current obsession, Dr. Leonard Landis, who I don't even know where to start. He was born in 1870 in Romania to a family of bankers from his father's side, publishers from his mother's side. He claims some rabbinical lineage, but seems to have been raised in a simulated fashion, educated in public school and gymnasium. After he graduated in 1886, he went to America, where he graduated NYU Medical School in 1892. And this little biography is actually from New York University. It's history, influence, equipment, and characteristics. So he's one of their alumni. That's where I also got this charming image of him as a young man. So after NYU, he returned to Europe, where he studied in London and Vienna, and then went back to New York, where he opened up a private practice and took up many public roles, such as sanitary inspector of the Health Board of New York, and many, many others. The array of his work is astounding. He has multiple, I would say more than 12 manuals, sort of studies of sex in Yiddish. He edited a Yiddish health journal called Gesund und Leben, started sometime in the 1890s, late 1890s. He wrote in English about psychology and sexuality, and he published 2 plays in English and plays in Yiddish and poetry in Yiddish. He had, I think, both a Yiddish and an English radio show. And my favorite is the last work of his that I was able to find that's at the New York Public Library called Beyond Psychoanalysis, Psychocosmology, where he discusses, it's a very sort of rigorous account of psychoanalysis, and, perfectly normal looking, and then it goes into his own ability to see beyond the physical mind and eye, and describes his experiences with the 4th dimension. And he also invents something between the answering machine and an SMS, where he describes a dream in which there's an apparatus on the telephone which takes down messages when you're not there, and the tingly feeling he had all day after this dream. So let's look a little bit at some of the text. This is the picture of him from that 1926 psychocosmology work. I have to say it's a little disappointing because just because in his play Damaged Goods, which you can see a picture of damaged goods in Yiddish, he describes one of the characters. There's the young hysteric, and there's the doctor who is a man von mittleren Alter, zet euch viel jünger. So a middle-aged man who looks much younger. So you can judge for yourselves. And that's the last one of his works that I found. I found his place of death as New Jersey. I haven't pinned down time of death. So, I want to know everything I can about this man. So that's Damaged Goods, the play. The dating of everything I'll show you is kind of off in the catalogs here and elsewhere. It usually just says 19... and they don't have any dates within. The prices of the texts change, but inflation. So I'm not able to really date them. So that's the play, Damaged Goods. There's Der halber Mensch, the half person, half man. You can see this is a book about impotence. And maybe you can see from the image, his approach is not exactly soothing. We have it's blurry, but it's like half a man, half a skeleton, which includes the chapters Reasons for Impotence and Abnormalities and More Reasons for Impotence. And one of my personal favorites is his work Die Libe, that includes his chapter on sadomasochism and some of a depiction of an electric shock machine. He worked also at Bellevue and was a New York pioneer of both of shock therapy and also electrical massages of sorts. So he has that to his credit too. And finally, we'll look at Sinn gegen die Natur. First, there's a kind of ad for it in the back of another book. I think it is Sins Against Nature, with an image of Darwin and the Statue of Liberty. This is the cover of the book, and we can spend another moment on this because it gives you more of a sense also of the specificity of his work, because I don't know if you noticed, but the way it's laid out, it looks like a sefer. It looks like a religious, Jewish, historical, scholarly text. It's true for the layout of the font, and it even has a biblical quote that it opens with. I don't know if you can read where it says, Der Stolz von junger Leid ist der Kraft, from Mishle, from Proverbs. So he's really gesturing towards that tradition of Jewish textuality. But at the same time, this is interesting. It's this is the psychocosmology book, and it's imitating his imitation of a sefer, but in English. And this is from the opening of the introduction to Sind gegen die Natur. And you can see if the cover page is gesturing towards this historical text, here we're going for the ultra-modern, which to us does not look ultra-modern at all. But you can see there's a patent date for the vibrating machine, the elektrische machine that he has. And while the illustration of the then ultra-modern machine marks this book as a product of its time, in the introduction itself, the author also looks back. He writes, I don't know if you can read, Halavai, if only our parents and grandparents had read such books, he writes. So he casts the text as something that should have been available to the past. At the same time, he also looks forward, asserting that the book will radically alter the future by producing a much healthier generation and stronger persons. So this text, however, is barely available to those future generations. It exists primarily in the archive and in a language with a more limited audience for consumers of scientific sexology in Yiddish. Rather than using this as a moment to join the heralding of the death of Yiddish, I do want to try and stop and kind of characterize my own engagement with Yiddish, because it's interesting to be doing this work while not looking at the life of ultra-Orthodox contemporary sex in Yiddish, or at the smaller groups of people engaged in Yiddish revival or continuity. And I'm basically not looking at that particular contemporary sex in Yiddish, because I'm specifically looking at Yiddish outside of the realms of that normative transmission, at the same time as I'm trying to look at a sexual practice outside of that reproductive transmission as well. And that's, I think, one of the avenues of history that this sexology kind of opens up for us. And Dr. Landis, his Yiddish writing itself, was very conscious of the use of language, not so much necessarily the use of Yiddish and the politics of Yiddish, but rather how language was being used to target different audiences. We have evidence from this from the 1921 Cleveland Health Survey report that bemoans quacks. They write advertising medical services to immigrant groups, and the report refers to the same quack, Landis, writing ads in several papers calling to my Romanian brothers, to my sick Lithuanian brothers, and even sick Italians, don't be discouraged. Thousands of your countrymen have found health and happiness by going to see Dr. Landis. So his address changed based on the language of the community he was addressing, and apparently he also would stress the importance of going to see a doctor who shared your tongue, writes Alan Kraut in his book Silent Travelers, Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace. The Landis of the 1929 report, he writes, is the same Landis who was prosecuted in New York State by the Bureau of Industries and Immigration in 1915 and given 30 days and a fine of $100 for placing such advertisements. Apparently it was illegal to advertise medical services. So of his different languages, I've only found works in Yiddish, English, and one in Polish. That's the Przyjaciel Mężczyzn, the Männerfreund in Polish. It appears to be a pretty exact translation of the Yiddish, except then it includes all sorts of letters to the doctor from people with Polish names, you know, one complaining about a sexually transmitted disease and the other one celebrating the cure from it. So I don't know if that means he had a whole different clientele of Polish-speaking people. I don't know if they're Jewish or not. And according to that report, there should probably be parallels in all these other languages, which I haven't found yet. So the advertisements that got Landis in trouble with the law only appear in the Yiddish text that I found so far. And if we go back to the elektrische machine, you can see one at the bottom. There's rhyming couplets, and he has them almost on every single page of many of his works. This is one that repeats, but many of them seem to be original. So this one is Dr. Landes Adresse vergesst noch nicht, 140 East 22. Street. And they all rhyme, so don't forget his address, 140 East 22nd Street. Other examples are Es Leiden von Onanism, Tiere sei groß, sei klein, Menschen, welche leiden, darfen zu Dr. Landes gehen. So animals big and small suffer from masturbation. Humans who suffer from it should go to Dr. Landis. It rhymes in Yiddish. Actually, the Polish book also has one attempt at a rhyming couplet, but it's even worse. So there's a lot more to be explored. So much more. I'd like to know about his personal life. I know he was married because one of, or a few of the books, they always have invitations to his office hours, and a few of them say that women should go see his wife at a different address. I also found a New York Times clipping of his wife suing him for alimony in 1907. So there's that. And yeah, I intend in the future to spend a lot more time, reading the work in depth and analyzing both their language and their science, or not quite their science, but point of view on the world. For now, that's just a taste, not to mention his clairvoyance, which, So looking at Landis and the other translations and original Yiddish works from Jerusalem, Buenos Aires, New York, Los Angeles, starting as early as 1900, a complex map emerges, reflecting the dispersion of Yiddish-speaking Jews and their interaction with local cultures. Overall, the motivation of both the translations and the original works seems to be one, to bring the emergent scientific discourse of sex into the world of Yiddish speakers, aiding them in the process of becoming modern subjects. This impetus goes against some strands of Jewish political thought that would have the modernized Jew abandon Yiddish entirely. As careful examination of this of Yiddish sexology reveals, instead of leaving the language behind, Yiddish sexology had a deep connection to and radical impact on the status of Yiddish itself. And indeed, the two projects I will now turn to belong to Yiddish linguists, two of the most important Yiddish linguists, and are situated at the juncture between language, politics, and sexual practice. The first representing the language, or scientific language, in its becoming, and the other in its decline. Nonetheless, both offer today's reader a unique opportunity of encounter with the body in and of Yiddish. So, Max Weinreich, let's see, old picture, needs very few introductions here as we gather under the auspices of the Weinreich Center. Important details are mainly that he was one of the founders of YIVO in Vilna, lent his energies and his apartment, and then took part in the reestablishment of YIVO in New York after he immigrated in 1940. His contribution is immeasurable, and there are people sitting here who are doing amazing work on his linguistic contribution and institutional contribution, like Leiser Bilko, who has been a great help to me also, and others. But I want to focus on kind of one line of his work, and that's the place where his interest in linguistics intersects with an interest in psychology of sexuality. In my broader project, I'm looking at places where Weinreich writes about sexuality, translates sexuality, and through him thinking how we can conceive philology more broadly as activating not just a love of language, but an erotic methodology in itself. Like Landis, Weinreich was very interested in Freud and psychoanalysis, without the clairvoyant element, to the best of my knowledge. So Weinreich wrote a monograph in Yiddish called Psychoanalyse, Sigmund Freud und sein Schechter, Psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud and His Method, published in Vilna in 1937. And between 1936 and 1938, he undertook an ambitious translation project of Sigmund Freud's Introduction to Psychoanalysis, for which Freud himself gave a brief introduction. In Yiddish, you'll see it's not an introduction at all. It says it's instead of an introduction, and it's a letter that actually consists of him declining to write an introduction because he's declined to do so in the past, and if he changed his mind now, too many people would be upset. And he also describes taking the text in hand but not being able to read it because he never learned how to read Hebrew or Yiddish, making him nonetheless fault a good Jew if, as you presumably know, he writes, not a believer. Reading these words in Yiddish or listening to them in English and viewing their Yiddish, much like Freud himself did, what is interestingly absent is the German original, as this text imitates the letter form and erases the act of the letter's translation, making Freud's non-introduction that extra bit more Yiddishlech, alongside making Weinreich's Introduction to Psychoanalysis a kosher Freudian text. While Weinreich had planned to translate the entire introduction, in practice he only got through 2 of 3 intended parts, so it ends on the dream works. And the linguistic notes in his copy of the introduction, that's also up here in YIVO, are concentrated mainly in the section that follows. So in the sexuality stuff, stopping midway through the section, development of libido and sexual organization. So this leaves us the actual Yiddish vocabulary of Freud's theory of sexuality, or a large part of it, somewhere between draft form and absence. In 1935, while the translation project must have been well underway, but not yet began to be published, and it was serialized, I should say, Weinreich began to formulate his own account of Jewish coming of age, pairing readings of Freud and his contemporaries with autobiographies of Jewish youth to write Der Weg zu unserer Jugend, the way to our youth. You can see a little picture from one of those autobiographies. I don't know if people are familiar with this project, but YIVO announced a competition, and young people from all over Eastern Europe sent in first-person stories of their lives in Yiddish, but also Polish and other languages. So Weinreich's text, The Way to Our Youth, uses these primary materials alongside scientific sociology and psychology to lay out some fundamental characteristics of Jewish young adulthood. Now, despite setting out to give this account, at the close of the book, Weinreich confesses that, in fact, the sexual life of Jewish youth has barely come into the discussion, and calls this the blois, the bareness of the book. This stands in contrast to the author's insistence on the crucial role of sexuality at the outset of the study. The reasons for this absence is simple. Despite the materials he has at hand, Weinreich writes he, I quote, knows nothing about the specific developments in the sexuality of our youth. To rectify this lack, Weinreich prefaces the book with a call to readers to write and let him know if their experience confirms or contradicts the experience described in the book, reinforcing their partnership with him in the documentation process. Weinreich's readers are partners not just in the act of narration, but also in the creation of the language of the book and the language of Yiddish sexuality in the making. Acknowledging the nascent state of the field, Weinreich opens with what he calls an apology for the language of the book. The word he uses for apology, hisneisles, is Lashon Kodesh, so a Yiddish word of sacred Hebraic origins, rather than what I think is the more common Germanic term, Entschuldigung. In fact, Weinreich writes, many of the terms of the book itself will sound somewhat foreign, but he adds, I see no way around this. Yiddish does not have the adequate expression for everything. One must become a partner in the process of creation, Maaseh Breshis, the term for the biblical Genesis, to a greater degree than is desirable. This partnership is cast as an almost holy task of procreation, implied in the very choice to use the biblical term, Maaseh Breshis. Critiquing popular Yiddish scientific style, Weinreich demands that we turn to Jewish linguistic sources instead of simply transcribing German words, fooling ourselves, or sich opnarren, into thinking they are Yiddish. The fact that Yiddish, like modern German, has its roots in Middle High German certainly enabled easy travel of the language of German sexology, itself a hybrid combination of Greek and Latin. And that is indeed the case in the majority of Yiddish sexological studies that I opened with, which Weinreich does not even mention. This omission itself is rather interesting. I mean, one thing is that all of Landis's texts are published in the U.S. And relatively early on, so there is a possibility that those particular texts weren't necessarily arriving in Vilna, but other texts were certainly extremely accessible. But in fact, we can only glean their existence inadvertently as the butt of Weinreich's linguistic critique. And indeed, resisting the Germanizing trend, Weinreich also argues that German itself is not sufficient because many terms he needs have not yet been named in German. From this, we see Weinreich was intent not only on creating a new Yiddish language, but also, mamish, a new language and even method science of sexuality. Through Weinreich's insistence on the existence and importance of a specifically Jewish coming of age, and through the linguistic project he linked it to, Yiddish speakers as sexual beings would be able to make their own contribution to the study of sexuality more broadly. At the same time, the work itself becomes a kind of process of maturation, parallel to the physical one it is describing, after which Yiddish and its speakers should reach the phase of mature sexual activity. Moving from this language in maturation to language in the face of decline, I want to turn to what I believe is one of the last Yiddish sexolinguistic projects to date, besides, say, my own, or I don't know if I'm not sure yet if I'm writing about it or participating in it. But this is the archive of Libe, Love, the archive that belonged to Mordkhe Schaechter. That's a good picture. So Schechter is another key figure of the institution that we sit in today. Also a Yiddish linguist, born in 1927 in Czernowitz, began working for YIVO in the DP camps after the war, collecting surviving Yiddish texts in Europe, and later in New York continued to work, research, teach, and write. I think he was a teacher of a number of us, you here. So while he was publishing Yiddish lexicons on academia, agriculture, childbirth, he was also compiling material for one final lexicon, focusing on Libe, love, or, as I hoped, sex. So I'd heard about Dr. Schechter's interest in the language of Yiddish sexuality, but it wasn't until Herschel Glaser mentioned that it was actually going to be a lexicon that I felt comfortable contacting his heirs to see if I could see what he had. And I was lucky enough, we were all lucky enough that the value of that material was recognized, and instead of being shipped off to storage in New Jersey, remained in his son Binyamin's home, where also Yiddish is the spoken language. So it's 5 shoeboxes in this archive. That's one of them that you can see. So, sitting in Schechter's granddaughter's room, I received the 5 shoeboxes containing mostly handwritten, alphabetically organized flashcards of words and phrases representing about 30 years of work, I would say 1960 to 1990, from what I can tell. The entries come from Yiddish literature, English and Yiddish press, scientific articles, advice books and columns, personal ads, and popular culture, to name just a few of the sources. You can see an example of a vagina card, and you can see the different examples. So a wide variety of Yiddish, whether they're euphemisms or not for the word vagina, some sort of more scientific, and without English translation. So it's not a dictionary. He's collecting the different Yiddish options for this body part. But the other cards, keep that. We'll keep that up for the rest of the talk. The other cards work in multiple directions. I would say a large number of them are words coming from Yiddish into English, and the Yiddish words are, some of them come from literature, from the Meisebuch, so 1701 Amsterdam, the quotes of romance and sexuality, all the way to I.B. Zinger stories still being serialized in the Yiddish press at the same time as he was also publishing in Playboy. So there's a literary aspect, and those are, recognized words of Yiddish sexuality, and then he will often offer an English parallel or not. There are words coming from English into Yiddish. A major source of these is all these little New York Times clippings, and then he'll underline a word in red of what he wants to translate. There's a lot of little pieces relating to Madonna and other, So it's a mirror of its time as a project itself. So he underlines words like top, and he doesn't give a Yiddish parallel. For bottoming, there's a number of parallels. There's sich unterwerfen, sich losen, untergeben. So we have all of those options. But it's interesting that some of the words don't have translations. The American press also gives him access to vernacular expressions, like the urge to merge. And then it's interesting because you can see he offers multiple translations that balance in different ways form and content. So there's cheshek zu tashmish, so it's like a desire to fornicate that has a kind of religious implication. Denken zu bet, yearning for bed, and that is closer to imitating the sound pattern of urge to merge. None of the translations are literal. Instead, they replace the rich sound pattern of the American expression with the Yiddish parallel. And in both those cases, both are, I think, a little bit more sexual than the English expression originally held. So some of the words don't have quoted sources, and they seem to be drawn from what we could say lowbrow plot lines, like there's the jet setter, and the debutantke, the debutante. So from some kind of, popular American sexual culture, there's also actual, sex culture, not just literary. The word for kukerai, peep shows, or emesdike sexerai, which is live sex shows, which he offers. And I don't know how many of these are his translations, how many are words that were actually circulating, So that demands a lot more study. What's interesting is how we can see the Yiddish and the English working in a really dynamic encounter. And at the same time, it's not just a translation, but using Hebraic, Slavic, Germanic components of Yiddish alongside Yiddish, Schechter is also continuing Weinreich's project of language creation by offering striking compounds and novel inventions. So for oral sex, he suggests mechabed sein mit filatio, so to honor with oral sex. And it's interesting because he's using the Hebraic term for honor, as in the biblical honor thy father and thy mother, or also offer food, together with the technical term. My mother is laughing really hard in the front row. So the technical term, the Latin term fellatio. A one-night stand is an ein nachtel. So, so it's using a Germanic word, but creating a Yiddish compound diminutive. A quickie is a chaplapel. So it's a Slavic sound and the verb chappen. So it's all drawing on the possibilities that Yiddish already offers in its intimate interactions with other languages. One more, you should be curious. Compiling and creating a Yiddish vocabulary for sexuality, and specifically, I would say, non-reproductive sexuality. Schechter's archive transmits a language that is itself, by now, in part, not reproductive. In so doing, his archive, alongside the broader archive of Yiddish sexuality I'm compiling here, offers a new story of queer transmission and queer practice alike, an archive that is queer in the material that it holds and in the modes in which these materials are reached. In both the published sexology found in the archive and Weinreich's attempt to create a new scientific language, if both of these reflect the past existence of a lively market of Yiddish consumers, Schechter, on the other hand, was trying to consolidate Yiddish as a complete and self-sufficient language in the face of American assimilation, no doubt with an awareness of its precarious future, in the hopes that having Yiddish words for contemporary Lebensstil, that's his term for lifestyle, would ensure the continued use of Yiddish. In this aspiration, Schechter is himself conceiving of his archive as, I quote, a movement of the promise and of the future, no less than a recording of the past, as Jacques Derrida writes of the archive in Archive Fever. But of course, the archive, Schechter's archive, is merely a byproduct of the work Schechter intended to produce and ultimately did not. This archive reflects a work in progress, as Schechter's heirs emphasize. It was his children's generosity that gave me access to this privately owned section of the archive. At the same time, they were very careful to stress that he would not have wanted his work published in an unfinished form, meticulous scholar that he was. But to me, the archive is appealing precisely for its current state, which freezes a moment that was dynamic and multi-temporal in a way that a finished product could not. For if the Lexicon of Love were published in Schechter's life, it would have offered no more and no less than definitive definitions, which, due to the decline of the language, would have a limited audience and limited use. Instead, in its unfinished, unedited, unofficial state, this archive allows us, following Ariel Azoulay, to see the archive as a shared place, a place that enables one to maintain the past incomplete, or to preserve what Walter Benjamin referred to as the incompleteness of the past. Schechter's Yiddish archive manifests such incompleteness, much like the incompleteness Weinreich struggled with for the opposite reasons, as the scientific language was in early stages of inauguration. Despite their different historical moments, because both men belonged to disappearing generations of non-Orthodox native Yiddish speakers, this incompleteness is an essential part of their projects. Landis's work, now accessible only through the archives, seems to take Yiddish writing for granted, but both his language and his science are very much marked as a thing of the past, now obsolete. When it comes to his science, this is rather a relief. When it comes to the language, it seems the linguistic reality Landis was part of might have been gone even before Weinreich, and certainly before Schechter even came of age. Offering a beautiful concept for archiving the transients we are encountering, Anne Cvetkovich proposes an archive of feelings. This archive, she writes, will always remain ephemeral because it is both material and immaterial, at once incorporating objects that might not ordinarily be considered archival, and at the same time resisting documentation because sex and feelings are too personal or too ephemeral to leave records. And yet, once sexual feeling and practice are put to language, and more specifically to paper, they leave an undeniable material trace, one that becomes all the more vital as those who lived them vanish. At the same time, it is through the archived text that we finally get access to bodies past. This mode of research, what Elizabeth Freeman calls erotohistoriography, opens, I quote, a politics of unpredictable, deeply embodied pleasures that counters the logic of development. It is the present precariousness of Yiddish that demands a new understanding of the logic of development. It cannot rely on the forward movement of reproductive, heteronormative cultural transmission and its future promise. Rather, like the archive itself, in the words of Derrida, it opens a question of the future itself. Instead of answering this question, or hoping to reproduce a viable future in the classroom or the bedroom, my incomplete, in-progress project joins the incompleteness of the shared space of the archive. As we sit in this archive here together, all I want to offer is pleasure now. What? Yeah?
If you have any, we'd like to take some questions.
I don't know if what I'm going to ask is going beyond the scope of your research, but you're talking about Yiddish trying to actualize itself and mixing. Mm-hmm. And at that time, it was also a big change in medical history. It was when doctors were taking over midwifery. It was when Freud started to talk about sex more overtly. So do you think that the Yiddish was allowing the people catching up with these trends, or they remain insular in spite of actualizing their language? What I'm saying is, is the language following the practice or forcing the practice, or did the communities continue with their practices even though the language was moving ahead?
I mean, we're talking about sort of different kind of long history, but is this close enough, the microphone? but I think there's definitely movement back and forth, and Landis is a great example for this because other works that I saw that were sort of more translation were easier to kind of call external influence, or sort of not necessarily coming from within the Jewish community, but there's something both about the sheer volume of Landis's production in Yiddish on the one hand that makes it seem like a sort of phenomena in itself, and at the same time, if he's doing this work in multiple communities and multiple languages at the same time, then that renders at least one branch of Yiddish sexology as completely part of a broader scientific community. Yeah, sure.
What were the years that Mordkhe Schechter was working on this project? Do you have a sense of that? And
Yeah.
And did he do any writing about his interest in it, or about his? Did he have any self-reflections that you could find, either that he offered verbally to people, or that he had written about it?
The years from the little notes and things look to me like 1960 to 1990, but some of the materials could definitely be older than that even. And his reflection, I don't know, maybe Laser knows or somebody else in the audience who knew Mordkhe Schechter personally might know. I do get a sense that this was one of the things he talked about to people, because even people who didn't know specifically about the lexicon would say, oh, Schechter was very interested in the language of Yiddish sexuality. And so even before knowing about this concrete possibility, I feel like that's part of the reputation and the legend. So I take it was important, and as much as there might have been some discomfort in the sharing of unfinished, unfinalized linguistics aspect, I think the dirty parts of it were definitely seem to me to be something that he would have been glad to have discussed.
Well, I was a student of his at Columbia, and he certainly never mentioned it in class.
Yeah.
He only talked about his botanical lexicon in class.
That's my next
and
talk.
In the
Stick
2
around.
years of studying with him, he never mentioned this particular. But
Yeah.
maybe talking to undergraduates in the 70s, he felt.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Weinreich's use of solicited biographies as the source for his work on the development of youth, and then his call for more in neglected areas, strikes me as an incredibly early use of crowdsourcing.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do any of those second wave of solicited memories exist? Can they be mined for the subjects of sexuality?
Of things responding directly to his call if they got dirtier because he asked them to. I don't know that. I think that's check-inable. I don't think that there would be more of that particular competition. That competition of YIVO calling for. Eddie, do you know?
There are unpublished autobiographies from these competitions that you can look at. I'm sure people have gone through them.
There was a later competition in America, in the American.
Yeah. So there was a later, and actually the movement specifically from the Eastern European-based project to the American one is really interesting to me. Looking in the Weinreich papers, I saw a kind of funding application report where we're sort of justifying the continuity of the project, even though it was going to become now an English language project. He was still sort of citing the specificity of Jewish experience with a particular linguistic echo, even though the American Jewish reality he was setting out to explore was taking place in English. What we do for these funding grants, you can twist anything into a continuous project. But
thank you. It was brilliant. Although I'm not sure I got everything in English, but it was brilliant. I was wondering, you really triggered my curiosity about this Landes. He seems so multifaceted. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, this beyond psychoanalysis, were you able to recognize in this beyond psychoanalysis something of the early, I would say, proto sexual liberation movement of the Jungian that was contemporary. And that was one question, and maybe I will have another.
Yeah, he has a whole section in Beyond Psychoanalysis dedicated to Jung. So I didn't read that yet, but it's at the New York Public Library, and somebody should take a look. That's all I know. So I just found this. I was not I wasn't even aware that he had. Yeah. Yeah, and also very much kind of pre-affect theory, talking about the forces working upon us in the world. He wrote 2 plays in English called The Playwright, His Partner's Wife, and another one. Yeah.
Your presentation of him, I will say like my book,
Mm-hmm.
was to me very queer normative,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you had this luster about his appearance at middle age. You know, he looks like a Jewish man around 50.
Yeah. No, my laughter is at him describing himself as looking much younger, which is yeah.
I'm teasing you.
Yeah.
So you were provocative.
Yeah. Please.
You deserve questions.
Thank you. I consent.
So my feeling is that it's a very complex personality.
Yeah.
And so it appeals for more information, and especially about his cure. His
Yeah.
theory. How was he? What is his clinic approach?
Yeah, so that's definitely something that would need a lot further research, and I'd be interested also specifically in the difference in the method in the Yiddish text versus the English text, and also if we have writing from one physician spanning 30 or 40 years, and these are very important years if you ask about the emergence of specific, scientific sexology and psychology, the difference between what one was doing in, 1895 and 1926 is vast. So to have that narration is really interesting. One of it would be, beyond psychoanalysis, you have to have a whole history of the reception of psychoanalysis to be able to write that. He also writes, at this point, we're not quite sure yet what we think about Freud and beyond psychoanalysis. So, yeah, but there's definitely more to look at. Yeah.
I think
can we just follow the mic because
sorry.
we're audio
Yes.
recording?
I apologize.
Sorry.
I didn't see you.
Just one question. I wondered, in terms of these dictionaries, do any of them have any influence on, how should I put it, the heteronormative ultra-Orthodox community in terms of their vocabulary surrounding sexuality? Have you done any work in that area?
I mean, I would probably the influence is vice versa, because this isn't, a published work. The question would be sort of, is Schechter also looking at these kind of sources? And my sense is it looks like not, and that looks kind of shocking in itself as well. And my own project kind of continues that shocking oversight in a way, So what does it mean to be so focused sort of historically or from your particular point of view on history, and to not be working with that whole community? There are, contemporary, both, there's still different kind of sex marriage manuals being written today in Yiddish, and there's certainly, an active kind of chat room scene, whatever. So there would be places back then, in the 90s to look, and definitely places to look now. Yeah. Okay.
To what extent do the early sexology works and Landis' work and Weinreich's work and Schechter's work incorporate or discuss non-heteronormative or queer sexuality?
Deeply, but in very different ways. One of the rhyming couplets is, if your son is a homosexualist, go fast to 22nd Street. So the homosexual or in general deviant sexuality is there to be cured. But that's one of the most amazing things about sexology, because other texts don't necessarily give us a report of that history. Things that weren't part of kind of mainstream literary culture or other forms of culture, suddenly through sexology have a historical account that's then available through the archive. So that's one place. And then if in Weinreich stuff, I didn't see a discussion of it, but the Weinreich I'm sort of playing with, because the Weinreich is more about what isn't there than what is there to a certain degree, both because of the missing parts of the translation and the missing parts of the language from the competition. And then in Schechter's work, there's a ton of vocabulary for queer sex, for threesomes, for this, that, and the other. Yes. Yeah.
Hi. Did you come across even hints of a feminist perspective on sexuality in the early or the more contemporary?
From these projects, none. Not at all. Nothing. Empty terrain. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the place where I sort of find that avenue and the female voice is a lot more through the work that I do on Yiddish poetry, and specifically erotic Yiddish poetry. And hey, I like poetry more than I like sexology anyway. So nishkosha. But in the poetry there is a very strong voice of Yiddish sexuality from a female and feminist perspective.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you for a very riveting discussion. I don't know what it's called. In the form of a question, I'm sort of faking it. It's not really a question, but I'd like to open something for discussion and get your take on something. You seem to be mentioning a lot of, if you take a step back and think about the nexus of sexuality and Jewish guys, there seemed to be a big difference in the translation when they're talking outside to the larger Goyish society. Mm-hmm. We're talking about, a transmission from Freud to Dr. Ruth through what's his name in Berlin in the 20s. They have a lot of...
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot his name.
Mm-hmm.
Not only do they have answers in a quick and ready language to use to the different cultures that they're speaking to, they're like Moses on the mountain. Everybody waits to hear what they say. Somehow, when they're talking into their own community, there's a lack of language. Nobody. Are you thinking about that, about translation, and did you think about that comparison?
That's a super interesting question. Yeah, I haven't come across any piece that says of sexology that says translated from the Yiddish, the long-awaited translation of. So that direction isn't happening. But in terms of the role of sort of both kind of the Jewish German sexologist, but also the Jew as figure of deviance. So to have that kind of history, and then have a history of sexology in Yiddish that's not in the slightest bit pathologizing Jewish sexuality, in part because it is an internal discussion. That's and interestingly, the examples in the Yiddish sexology are more Yiddishlich, and even there's some Talmud stuff thrown in there. The sadomasochism chapter ends with, it's state in Talmud that actually before you marry a woman, you should meet her brothers because of a case of someone who married someone and then she killed his whole family. This very, very weird story that I can't tell what it has to do with the Talmud, but there's gestures to it. So there's a Jewish history that's also not tied to like a European pathologizing of Jewish sexuality or Jewish masculinity, but its own trajectory. But in the examples in the Beyond Psychoanalysis, they're all in Scotland and Ireland, and so that might even be like a conscious resistance of offering the Jew as example for sexual abnormality. Yeah.
This is very, very rich stuff, and I'm looking forward to reading more and hearing more as your research develops. I enjoy this a lot. I have a couple of questions that are related to one observation on this card, because it's been up for so long, I've really been studying it. So, the Muttershade is obs. Is that obsolete or obscene? Because it seems like your project is kind of predicated between the two. And with that in mind, I want to ask first one slight digression. When
Yeah.
Freud is protesting that he can't read Yiddish or Hebrew, he was never taught, this is somewhat facetious, as you
Yeah.
probably know from Yerushalmi's work, to which Derrida is
Yeah.
responding in Archive Fever, that Freud certainly was taught Hebrew, and
Yeah.
his protestation to the contrary, somebody should psychoanalyze that. But,
Yeah.
but the question that I want to ask is really predicated on what Joss Lambert has written about in Unclean Lips, about the odd place of Yiddish language publishing in the history of American obscenity trials.
Yeah.
That there's a sense that Yiddish fiction kind of goes under the radar somewhat, that the censors are slower to catch it
Yeah.
than they were with English stuff, and so that Yiddish stuff by Apatashu and by other writers was being smuggled into English as a way of testing the limits of what free speech could allow maybe 90 years ago. So I'm wondering if you see something complementary in the recording of this archive,
Yeah.
in the development of this terminology, and the status of Yiddish. It's hidden, it's outdated, but it's a language for saying the unspeakable.
That's a great observation, and also supercharged. I feel like it can, be positioned in sort of many different ways. Because we can also think about the way we allow ourselves to say really dirty things in Yiddish in a place, as Michael Wex writes, where you would say schmuck where you wouldn't say cock in a public setting, like I just did. Right? So there's...
And before Michael Wex, there's Uriel Weinreich talking about languages in contact, which makes this point in a linguistic sense.
Interesting.
The way in which, why is it that the 36 Yiddish words that every American Jew knows are, how to cook a potato kugel, how to go to the bathroom, and how to call somebody a son of a bitch.
Yeah.
All immigrant languages get passed down in this 36 word vocabulary
Yeah.
to the next generation.
And I have a sense that Yiddish even more so in a way, because also it's because I think it's true also for non-Jewish, especially American contexts where swear words or things like that in Yiddish are used. So I'm just bringing that up because there's something about the unspeakable, speakable, where I'm not sure which direction it works. And that's equally true for some people will say to me, oh my God, everything, Yiddish is so associated with sex. This is so obvious. Whereas the kind of other perspective is equally like, Yiddish has nothing to do with sexuality. And it's often people relating to really kind of the same popular phenomena, the same role Yiddish plays in American culture. So I can't quite put my finger on it. I think looking at concrete histories of publication, also of theater. I know Matthew Hoffman's thing about the passing game and the different productions of Ashes Gott von Nekama, and the lesbian content that worked in Yiddish and then not in one of the English productions. I think looking at these really concrete histories, whether of the archive or of these publications, is a great way to try and figure out what exactly is going on. And I think psychoanalysis would be very helpful also, because it is something not pinned downable. The stuff I've been doing with fetish is also kind of looking at that very directly, at something that's happening on the cusp of humor and abject and erotic. But it's all in progress, and I will continue to think about these things. Yeah.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions.
I guess we'll talk more about it a little bit later, but there's an interesting, it's not exactly correspondence, but the sort of interchange between Uriel Weinreich and Schechter about Uriel Weinreich's dictionary, which is sort of the opposite of this love and sex lexicon, because it's basically purged of almost all sexual connotations or dirty words or anything like that. And there's all sorts of, Schechter makes all sorts of comments about how can you leave out this and this and this word which is so common and which is so and he deliberately decides to exclude everything.
Interesting.
And also there's sort of I guess related to that is sort of there's an interesting sort of reaction that Max Weinreich has to the joys of Yiddish, which he also takes issue with all the vulgarisms and all the sexual obscenities and things, and so you sort of put them in the same boat, but there's
Yeah.
And I'm not sure, I don't know, I think probably people in the family could talk more about it or would know more about it, but I know that I read in some of his autobiographical materials that on the boat over to America, Schechter was, he observed for the first time people from like the Jewish underworld,
Mm-hmm.
and people who spoke a really exotic, I don't know exactly, kind of like lobster kind of Yiddish.
Yeah.
And I think he was very much sort of taken by that, and that was kind of inspiring. And I'm sure they were saying a lot of these things which she's recorded.
Yeah, that might be the one hidden source. Thanks. Yeah.
I knew Mordkhe Schechter pretty well. Hi, Zoe.
Hi.
I'm his son, Benjamin. And just to add to some of what Zoe said, actually, let me first answer Mark's question. The OBS is obsolete, not obscene. I think if it were obscene, it would be VULG for vulgar. But I wanted to add to what Zoe said that he had 3 projects that he still wanted to finish.
Mm-hmm.
This was one, the Libe terminologia. Another one was the Essen terminology. He wanted to do a Yiddish-English terminology of food, of like both the European dishes and how you'd say them in English, as well as the American dishes and how you'd say them in Yiddish. And his magnum opus was to be the English-Yiddish dictionary of the 21st century, to help people who are still wanting to speak Yiddish with their children today, or to write in Yiddish, and they know English better, a source where they can just go to for every English word that they could possibly think of, or phrase, or combination. And he didn't finish any of those 3 projects, but those were his pet projects.
Yeah.
And the reason why the Libe and the Essen terminologia, are the reasons why I took those 2 sets of card files to my apartment rather than having them get lost in a warehouse in New Jersey, is because I knew that they were especially important to him, and I had the hope that they would ever come out in some form or shape.
And are you working on them now?
So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is that the third project I mentioned, the magnum opus, the dictionary for the 21st century in English Yiddish, the Libe terminologia has been mined for that. And that's going to be, that they're hoping that's going to be coming out in the next year or 2. Hopefully later this year, if not early next year. And it's going to be, it's going to be much larger than any English Yiddish dictionaries have been up till now. And it will have, obviously, even dictionaries that came out in the 60s, they didn't have the words that have been found, have been discovered in the last 40 years, but they also were not complete, comprehensive, unabridged dictionaries. So this one, though there are certainly to be some words that are missing, it's going to be very full and very complete with tens of thousands of words, many of which have never been in any Yiddish dictionary before. And much of the Libe terminologia, with decisions that were made, they couldn't give like all the possible options, but decisions had to be made in certain cases of which were better to recommend. And I'm sure, and even in those cases, they might have had like a medical option, a religious option, a vulgar option. So they will be in there. So so you and everybody else will be able to use that dictionary when it comes out, and the League for Yiddish is publishing it.
Yasher koach.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.